Well, we think it's important because we see that schools are a place where expectations are formed for higher education. Obviously, pedagogical practice and the experience of school is very different from the experience of university, but nevertheless, incoming students, their expectations are formed by wherever they come from, which is very often school. So expectations about digital environment, such as the way the VLE is used, or the nature of seeking out information, or how digital environments relate to teaching that takes place in the physical environment, the relationship between those two things. So to gain a better understanding of, it's essentially where incoming students are getting their ideas from about what university should be up to. We believe that it comes from school, and that's why we want to know more about that.
We know that it's not just from school. Obviously, students have their expectations framed by their commercial experience of the devices they choose and by the workplace. Even if they're school leavers, they've probably got some experience of that. So we understand that there's a whole range of factors, but certainly the school experience seems to be very significant in there.
And also, I think that students have quite a clear picture of practice, technology-related practice within that formal context of school, within the institution, even though their experience of technology will be much broader than that these days. And we suspect that they bring that sense that the institution is this kind of box that has certain technologies and certain practices in it, even though my practice as a student might go way beyond that, outside of that sort of formal context, even when universities perhaps want to push more innovative forms of engagement or pedagogy on their digital platforms within the institution. Perhaps sometimes students don't see that as the place where that should happen because of their experience previous from schools, or their relationship with commercial platforms out on the web.
I think it's a term that's been a useful one when we think about students' expectations, as opposed to what kind of experiences students might actually need to have for higher education to really be equipping them as kind of digital leaders and digital participants. So I've used the term transactional to describe the expectations students have about simply using the kind of services and information that's on offer at university. So how do I log on to systems? How do I make sure I've got my course calendar? All the bits and pieces of information that I need just to function as a student. And those expectations about transaction are set in all kinds of ways, but students have quite high expectations that they'll be able to use their personal devices, that they'll be able to access things the way they want to, that everything will be just a blink away. And I think we could kind of run until we're blue in the face to try and keep up with those transactional expectations, and we have to. But I think what students are coming to university for, and to college, as we've discussed this morning, as everyone has said this morning, is a kind of transformational developmental experience, including transformation in their relationship to technology and digital know-how. And those transformational experiences are not things that they can come necessarily expecting. They can come expecting in a general way to be challenged, that their practices will be changed, that the ways they do things now will not be adequate to what's going to be required, and all of those are helpful general expectations for them to have. But I think we have a clear responsibility to frame students' understanding that a transformational experience will not necessarily look like what they've done before, and that will include they're using digital systems that are unfamiliar, that use them in unfamiliar ways, that our criteria of judgment will be different, as academics or as professionals, to our criteria of judgment when we're on Facebook or reviewing something on Amazon. So I think I was using the term transformational in the sense of the kind of experience we know students in a general way expect and need to have, that's going to be different from the transactions they normally undertake with their digital technology.
Yeah, especially in that digital context. So the idea that perhaps the digital environment is a place where learning can happen, rather than just necessarily a source of content that I consume to get my assignments done, which I think is a significant shift from perhaps what happens in schools with technology. Not entirely, practice varies enormously, but that idea that the digital environment is somewhere where there's discourse, where the learning it has that sort of independent, that more grown up sort of higher education aspect to it, and that could be online, it is perhaps something that's quite challenging and quite difficult to support. Although what we do see is perhaps that taking place in informal contexts where students are actually discussing and chatting about their learning in somewhere like Facebook. But one of the challenges for us as researchers is that when you talk to students about that kind of practice, they won't necessarily define that as learning. They'll say, that was me talking about the course, and what they claim, or their understanding of what learning is perhaps narrower than their overall practices. So that, from a research point of view, it's quite a difficult thing to get hold of, I think, isn't it?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, following on a bit from the last sort of question and what Dave was saying, I think we identified this morning really clearly that in order to engage students in their learning experience, we have to go to the media they're engaged with. So some of that does mean learning as institutions how to use video, how to use QR codes, how to use interactive experiences, how to use gaming perhaps, in ways that are going to be engaging for students. But I think what's exciting for me is to think about how digital technology is transforming our core practices of research and scholarship and teaching, and sharing that with students. Now that is it's a world away from simply putting things into media that are acceptable to students. It's about fundamentally challenging and changing the way they see the world. And again, what came out very clearly from the conversation this morning is you can have really wise conversations with students about that, but unless as members of the institution we feel that we have something to offer, that we feel really firmly rooted in what is special about the further and higher education experience in a digital age when there is so much opportunity that is available out there on the internet, what's special about what we have to offer, and how do we communicate that to students? It's around how we use data in extraordinary ways, it's around how we visualise and communicate data, it's around how we do research, it's around, operations on text and how we publish and communicate in a scholarly way with text. All these activities are being revolutionised. And I think bridging for students that link between the media I'm comfortable with to those new practices is a real challenge. And I think the place to start with staff, in my experience, is always with the fact that you have something really unique and special to offer, which is because you're an academic or a professional. And let's get excited about how things are changing in your subject, in your profession. Get excited about that, be aware of that, be scholarly and reflective about that, and that will flow through to your students, and you'll be excited to engage your students in those conversations.
And I also think it's a question of finding out what practices are now as well, so finding ways that you can sort of facilitate conversations between staff and students. Personally, I think that if teaching staff could engage students and discover what that much broader sense of practice is. How do you go about learning using the internet? That's a big question. But if you can facilitate that conversation, I think that students would find it enormously supportive and encouraging if that conversation was had. I think the response from the institution or from teaching staff would quite often be, that's quite good. What you're doing is quite useful and quite effective. Carry on doing that. When you're doing this, maybe you want to think about this. I think that would go a long way, because it's certainly in research that I've done, you find that students are to a certain extent quite nervous or quite paranoid about their informal practices, because they are often quite basic, very effective, but somehow they get this implicit message from the institution or from culture as a whole that what they're doing isn't quite right, isn't quite authentic, and that really they should be in a library reading a book. I mean, that's an extreme.
I think it's explicit sometimes, isn't it? I mean, universities hedge around access to the internet with all kinds of warnings and fair use policies and warnings about plagiarism. And I mean, I actually think that sort of third-year students and graduate students can be great mediators of that conversation, because they know enough about academic and professional practice that they've evolved their own way of doing things, and they've kind of got enough confidence to say, well, it works for me. And actually often in their research groups they're leading the way, particularly when it comes to things like collaborative research environments and data visualisation. And they're great people to mediate those conversations with undergraduates about actually the authentic, successful digital practices that they could be evolving. And sometimes staff are not the best people to mediate those.
But for that to take place, and I think this is really important, the psychology of the institution, however you might want to think about that, has to accept that the web exists and that practice is much broader than what happens within that kind of traditional sense of the institution and a traditional notion of what education might be, and how that's shifting and expanding in ways that are enormously positive, but perhaps aren't part of the discourse of higher education yet, although we see it moving that way. So I think, overall we're quite positive about the general direction of things, but there are some areas that need some work, certainly in the sense of we need to gain a better understanding of what current practice is, and which direction it can be taken in, and the role of the institution in supporting students in evolving those practices, and in going through that higher education experience, really, so that when they leave, they've taken a kind of, I'm going to use the term journey, but they've gone on that journey from a fairly didactic point of view to becoming independent learners, and they can go out into the world confident in their own voice within their field, and being able to express themselves along those kind of lines. And I think the digital is a place where that sort of practice can be encouraged and supported. It's a great place for students and staff to be able to experiment with those sort of practices, and if it's used properly, it can be quite a safe place. It doesn't have to be as terrifying as suddenly starting blogging or suddenly rewriting half of Wikipedia. So it's finding those methods of doing that I think is important.
But it's hard for staff to make students feel safe in that space, isn't it? Because it is a borderless, it's a kind of semi-public, semi-private space, and students who are emerging their academic identity often feel quite nervous. And I think staff often feel quite nervous in those spaces too. So it's a big ask, really, to give up "we know, we teach you," which has always been the mode of academic discourse with undergraduates, at least. And, that's a big ask for staff to give that up and not to have some other safety net, because there isn't a safety net. So much of what they do is public. So much of what students do will have to become public. And I think we found that working on digital identity projects is a good way of giving everybody the sense of safety and of stepwise development. So taking staff through the process of becoming more aware of and in control of their digital identity as an academic, as a scholar, as a professional in their field, gives them a lot of confidence. It also gives them a lot of insight. And students are very hooked into anything that's going to encourage them to have positive identity, leaving college and so on. So often that identity work, which is kind of at the apex of our pyramid about digital literacy development, is actually a good place to start, rather than just the place you're aiming for after 3 years of study.